Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's special edition of AGU webinars titled AGU Narratives, Telling the Story of Our Science. Today we'll be talking about the AGU Centennial and our AGU Narratives Project, and talk about how you can get involved by recording interviews with the StoryCorps app. I'm Nathaniel Janik, Career Services Coordinator at AGU, and today I will serve as both host and presenter. I'm joined today by Victoria Forlini, Director of the Executive Office at AGU, who is leading the charge for the Centennial celebration, and Felicita White, Centennial Program Coordinator. A few logistics to go over before we begin. Throughout this session, we will be using some GoToWebinar tools to help you interact with us and fellow audience members. First is we'll be doing some polls throughout the session, and you'll see the first of those in just a moment. Secondly, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the session, so feel free at any point throughout the presentation, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the question box, and at the end of the presentation, we're going to get through as many questions as possible. We'll also have at least one question where it's a free response question, so when we ask that, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and answer that in the question box as well. We have some handouts. On the control panel, you'll see a handout tab. There are 3 handouts that we prepared that will help you with some information about AGU Narratives Program, some tips for preparing and doing your interviews, and those handouts can be downloaded at any time during the presentation. Finally, during this interview, we are recording it, so you'll get a link to the recording shortly after we complete this presentation. So now that I got that all out of the way, we're going to start things off with a poll. So you should be seeing that poll soon. All right, so the first poll that we have is which of these is a way that you can get involved with AGU Centennial Celebration? Present a paper at fall meeting, speak about your science at school or a community center, or record the memories of a fellow scientist. All right, and I'm going to give you just a few more moments to respond, and I'm going to close the poll now, and it looks like 100% 100% to speak about your science at a school or community center. So obviously that's one way that you can participate, but today we're going to talk about another way, and to talk about some of those, I'm going to pass it over to Victoria.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and for your interest in telling a story of science or in helping someone else tell their story of science. As Nathaniel said, I'm the staff lead for AGU Centennial, and while we talk about it as this 100th birthday of AGU, the real focus isn't AGU, it's the science and showing the value of science. So AGU Centennial's goal is to show the value and impacts of science over the past 100 years, in the present, and for the next 100 years, and how that impacts society every day. It is a very broad goal and very important. And to do that, we have to think about different themes. For the Centennial, when we think about telling the stories, we think about telling the past and future stories of the science. We think about telling it through legacy programs and impact programs. And we think about telling it through outreach and engagement, both within the scientific community and in the public communities. You see on the screen today a wonderful Venn diagram of the Centennial, which shows kind of different areas of focus for this large amount of global programming. And you see, of course, that they all intersect. I'll just go over these briefly, and I'll lead a little bit into the AGU narratives that we'll focus on today. So if we look at the Centennial as this celebration of science, of course, we'll have some pretty featured scientific programming. And that's for things like our fall meeting, doing joint sessions, or having overviews of the history or looking to the future, doing grand challenges in our publishing journals. We have more than 20 journals, and they're focusing on looking at the grand challenges of the future that Earth and space science can help impact or can help solve. So those are our main kind of scientific programming. We have other scientific programming around it that kind of surrounds it, like our mini campaigns in the bottom left circle, where we're going to be reaching out through social media and other communications and marketing tools to show individual scientists and what they have brought forward with their science and how it continues to move forward. We're going to be focusing on science days like World Oceans Days and featuring oceanography on days like that. Our Thriving Earth Exchange pairs up a community and a scientist. So it bridges both that public and that science. So you have a community that needs a problem solved or needs advice on how to handle an issue from an Earth and space scientist, and AGU will help kind of map that community and that science together for a 6 to 18 month project. There's a lot going on with our Centennial. We have legacy programs like an Ethics Resource Center that's trying to create a safe place and a resource center so we can have a scientific community free of workplace harassment issues or bullying issues. We have a lot of work on our legacy as well for student or early career support and looking at how we can help as an organization support financially or support in other ways for student and early careers. If you look at that bottom right, we also know that outreach isn't just for the public, and I saw the poll that everybody wants to go to a school, and that's terrific. I want to go to a school too, where my nephew is, and do part of that as my Centennial work. But scientific policy outreach is important, and that's both in the United States domestically, because the AGU is certainly based in Washington, D.C., and internationally. We're, for example, working on a policy resolution that's showing concrete impacts of Earth and space science that can be modified around the world. And we're working with worldwide scientific organizations and other partners to create this resolution and then have it be signed by, we hope, hundreds or thousands of communities, of corporations, of societies around the world to show the impacts and show a unity around the science. You look at all of these, and there's so many stories to tell. There's public lectures as well. We've got our headquarters renovation going to net zero energy-wise, and you kind of think, it's a lot. She's skipping all around those circles. Like, what kind of marries everything together? And that is the telling the story. The story that we kind of do an overarching look at for Centennial is what we call our discoveries to methodology to solutions. And that is being able to look at an event or an accomplishment or a time and place of Earth and space science and say, this is where the discovery started, and this is how we can show through all the different aspects of technologies, of collaboration, and of just working together. Now we've got a solution, or we're working toward that solution, kind of that constant movement. That's the story of science, right? Science is always moving forward. And so that's where AGU Narratives comes in. We've designed the AGU Narratives program to have anybody see themselves in Centennial. So we have very high-level parts of this program, formal oral histories, for example, with AGU past presidents or with kind of luminaries of the Earth and space science field talking about the inputs of science and the changes in science. And those are 4 or 6 hour interviews. They're very, very formal. We have kind of a medium level where we might go to a conference and record scientists for 15 minutes or 30 minutes. We have the StoryCorps, which is with the national broadcast on the National Public Radio in the United States, come and record people at our fall meeting in 2017. And then we have our AGU narrative that we'll be talking about today. And that is what we hope will be the bulk of the stories, because it's easy to do and everybody has a story to tell. And I think that's really incredible for everyone to think about, because your story of who you are, how you got into science, the work you do, the barriers you've overcome, even just your day in, day out, how you interact with people or how you think as a scientist, really is a story that goes to those discoveries to solutions. We want to be able to take these stories and help incorporate them with all of our other materials and all of our other content to create this larger story of the impacts of Earth and space science. So as we kind of think in that venue of how we're going to move our stories forward, Nathaniel and Felicity are going to take it right now, talk a little bit more about the programming and how you can easily be involved, and they are going to show you how to share that story.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Victoria. So, you just heard a little bit about what is this project, AGU Narratives. So now we're going to go through how you can get involved. So I'm going to go through the agenda really quickly here. So first, we're going to be talking about how do you get started in this process of getting involved with AGU Narratives, going out and collecting these stories. We're going to talk about how you prepare yourself for the interviews, Also talk about the AGU Narratives community. And for some of you may be asking, what does this mean, AGU Narratives community? And Felicity is going to talk a little bit about that later. We're going to talk a little bit about the StoryCorps app and show some screenshots of what it looks like, and talk about how you can use the app to get yourself ready for the interview, and also how you can use the app during the interview and after the interview to collect these stories. We're going to talk about interview tips, not at the StoryCorps app level, but just sort of how do you do an interview, what should you be thinking about while you're doing it. Talk about the steps that you need to be taking after the interview is completed, and then before we wrap up with the Q&A, we're going to talk about what's next for Centennial, AGU Narratives, and you. Now, I know that many of you probably are here because you want to learn more about how the StoryCorps app works. You've heard about this AGU Narratives project, and you want to know, like, what is this thing? What is this app you keep on telling us to download? And we're going to get there in just a little bit, but before we dive in it, I want to talk about what StoryCorps is. So StoryCorps, at its heart, is an oral history project. Now, oral histories are exactly what they sound like. They are the recording of real people talking orally about the past in an effort to save or preserve history. Now, history, just like science, has many different collection methods. You might study history by, say, analyzing a scientist's field journal, but you could also study that same scientist's history by just talking to them and recording their spoken word. So, like within science, you might have something that you're trying to analyze in an experiment, some hypothesis that you're trying to test, and you have many different methodologies that you can use to collect that data. And in that sense, oral histories are very similar. When you collect data in the field, the tools that you're using to collect that play an important role in the analysis of that data. And so I want you to understand that you are kind of being that tool and that methodology when you're engaging in an oral history interview. And through the data and interpretation of the data, like that, the interpretation of the data might be an important focus, but the tools and methodology that are used to interpret data can be just as important in an experiment. So, in that sense, when you're collecting a person's history, you are playing this massive role in the gathering of this data, this history. You're the one that's asking the questions, you're the one that's choosing the person who you're going to interview, and you're the one that's decided that you think that this interview format is the right method to collect this person's story. Like their stories of discovery or just any other memories that they might have. So we're hoping that this presentation gives you the right tools that you need to see yourself in that role and take charge of it and like actively engage in capturing this history, the collective memory of the Earth and space sciences. So, I'm sure that, other than the StoryCorps app, the next burning question that you probably have is, who am I supposed to interview? And that's going to bring us to our next poll. So as the poll launches, the question is, how far along are you in your AGU Narratives project? I'm here to learn how to get started. I've already uploaded an interview onto StoryCorps. I've scheduled an interview with someone. And then lastly, I have an idea of who to interview, but I haven't reached out yet. So we are going to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. All right. And so it looks like everyone here is hoping to learn how to get started, which is great. That means that you came to the right place. I'm going to help brainstorm with everyone some ideas of who you might interview. So you, depending on what level you're at, you probably have, an academic advisor. You might have a work colleague or a supervisor. It could be a professor that you have right now. It could be a professor that you had 5 years ago that you just loved love their stories that they would tell, and you think that they have something that's really worth capturing. It could even be talking to maybe a high school or middle school teacher that inspired you to go into the geosciences. The possibilities of who to interview are really limitless. It's just a matter of kind of sitting down and thinking to yourself, who can I talk to? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of thought on who you can talk to. So when you're getting ready to interview the person, as I just mentioned, obviously the first step is finding somebody to interview. It's impossible to ask somebody questions if you don't have that somebody to talk to. The StoryCorps app will let you, set up questions and answer them yourself. But really at the end of the day, it's about a dialogue. It's about having a conversation, and that conversational piece is really going to be what makes these stories more compelling. So first step, find somebody to interview. So once you found that person to interview, what questions are you going to ask? Now, this is another part of StoryCorps and StoryCorps app that makes it really great to get started in this world of oral histories, because in the StoryCorps app, it allows you, when you're creating interviews, it allows you to set up questions that you want to ask during the interview. And if you're on the StoryCorps site and you're logged in and you're part of a community, communities will have suggested questions that they can, sort of prompt your interview process. I got a slide up here. You'll see in this image some list of great questions that StoryCorps just offers themselves. A few other examples that aren't up here. I do the pass-through science profiles for AGU, and so some of the questions that I ask the people that I talk with about their careers are things like, who was an important mentor in your life and what advice did they impart upon you? Or what skills, whether they're technical or interpersonal, have been critical to your success in both your career and or work-life balance or your research, etc. I try to make them sort of open-ended. Now, of course, when you're putting together these questions and putting together your list, you do want to, do some homework, look at their CV, look at their resume, think about, maybe look at their thesis or their dissertation, read some of their papers to just get an idea of what sort of topics they studied and get a sense of what that timeline looks like. And that way, if it feels to them like you've done your homework, they're going to feel more comfortable telling you about their story. You don't need to know the whole thing, and you don't need to have it all mapped out, but knowing some answers to some questions is going to help, sort of break the ice. But while you do want to, of course, ask questions that you know the answer to, make sure that you also sprinkle in some questions where you want to know the answer. You're curious, because that curiosity, when you're asking the questions, is going to come out, and it's going to inspire them to give you a much better answer if they see that you're interested in knowing what that answer is. And also, I kind of touched upon this a second ago. Even though you kind of want to sort of script out what questions you're going to ask, it's really important to remember that at the end of the day, this is a conversation, not a script. You don't want to go in and just have these are the sound bites that I want to get in this interview, and I'm going to ask whatever questions I need to prompt them to say these exact things. Why don't you want to do that? Because it's going to come off as a little bit fake, or it might be that they don't give you the answer you expected, and suddenly you're thrown for a loop, and in the middle of the interview, you're not sure which way is up and down. You want to be flexible. You want to be listening. You don't want to necessarily stick to all of the questions. You want to be listening during the interview and maybe modifying the questions a little bit. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the part where we're talking about during the interview. So also, I mentioned earlier that, oral history, if you think about it, it can be a lot like a research experiment. And, well-designed research, you have your hypothesis, you have your desired outcome, you have what you think is going to happen, and it's the in-between of how to get there that gets you to the point where you have that conclusion. But obviously, when you have a hypothesis, you are thinking about what you need to do to get that outcome that you're hypothesizing will happen. So, putting together the thoughts on, like preparing your questions, and then also thinking about, what sort of data you're going to be collecting at the end of the interview is important during the pre-interview process. And so because of that, even though we're going to get to this later on in another slide, I just wanted to show some of the fields that you fill out at the end of an interview on the StoryCorps app. So you have the title of the interview, a brief description, you have some keywords so that people can sort of find it based on either the events or places that they're talking about, maybe the type of science that they're talking about. What we're going to hammer this in 5 or 6 more times, but if it's because you're presumably doing this for the AGU Centennial project, we want you to put in that keyword hashtag AGU100 so that it identifies it as part of the Centennial project. You're also going to be wanting to capture whoever is participating in the interview, and this sharing with the community we're going to touch upon in just a moment, but the community aspect is part of the StoryCorps sort of community, and I'm going to let Melissa talk about that, and I'm actually going to pass it over to her now.
Thank you, Nathaniel, and hello to everyone. StoryCorps has created an oral history style in which everyone and anyone can tell and share stories. Through the StoryCorps app, we have a unique opportunity to capture the untold stories of Earth and space sciences. At the StoryCorps archives, one can search for interviews, listen to stories, and join a community to share their own communities. Our community is called AGU Narratives. Today we will go over how to use the StoryCorps app and how to share it with AGU. The first step, so if we could just move to the next slide. The first step to be part of the AGU Narratives community is to create an account. And as I mentioned, the StoryCorps archives, one can search for interviews, listen to stories, and join a community to share their own stories. Begin by going to a web browser at archive.storycorps.com to get to the main StoryCorps archives page, as you see on the screen. It is most important to create an account through a web browser, then use the app. Interviews can be added online as well. At the archives page, you'll be prompted to log in or create an account. After you create an account, join AGU Narratives. You will have the option to join a community such as you see on the screen. On the next slide, you will see an example of how your interview will appear in your profile. Notice the Profile tab on the right-hand corner, which has a drop-down menu. Once you have finished an interview, you can share it with AGU Narratives, and it'll be shared with the greater AGU community and Centennial project. I will now pass it back to Nathaniel.
All right. Thank you, Liz. All right. So the next thing, we've gotten to it. You've gone to StoryCorps. You've gone to that archive.storycorps.org, and you created your account. You've joined the community. Now what? So the next step is to download the app on your phone. Then you'll log in, and when you log in, there isn't a screenshot of it here, but when you log in, there'll be an option to sort of look at the interviews you've already done, and then also an option to add a new interview. So when you add in a new interview, it's going to ask you for things like a title, and then it's going to prompt you, as you can see, what questions you'll ask, and that's where you get to look at the custom question list and add them to your interview before it happens. It's going to ask who you're going to interview, so you can put in that information, and then you can also at that point add in the community that you're intending to share it to before you go ahead and hit the record button to actually upload it to the StoryCorps community. So now that we've kind of talked about those steps, we're going to talk about what happens during the interview. So There's a whole lot of text on this screen, and I'm not going to cover it all. On the right-hand side, you'll see I've got sort of a who, when, where, why, how, just sort of prompts on like what you should be thinking about as far as making sure that your questions are open-ended. You'll see I noted that you want to make sure that you're providing context during the interview. Remember that when you're doing an interview, it's going to be an audio recording. So because it's audio, you might have situations where, for example, if people are using air quotes, you can't see, but I just used air quotes. You know, and if somebody's doing things like that where they're pointing at something, like maybe they're like, oh, that's the lab bench that I discovered this at. Maybe they just say, that's where I discovered this. You kind of have to fill in those gaps in your questioning and you know, say out loud, oh, that's the lab bench where you did that, so that you're providing that context. Beyond the context, probably the number one most important rule is finding a small, quiet room to record. You want to make sure that you're avoiding distractions as much as possible. You want to make sure that you've got a room, like I'm sure that right now, based on the acoustics of this room and that I can hear a little bit of reverb, the room that I'm in right now wouldn't be a good room to do an oral history interview with, because you might have some awkward sound pickup when you're doing the actual recording. You want to make sure that you're speaking directly into the microphone. Now, you might not have a microphone. If you're doing it strictly on your phone, you might not have an external microphone. So I would advise testing out your phone's microphone before you do an official interview. That way you know sort of which direction the mic is likely to pick up best from. Because if you spend 30 minutes talking to somebody and they tell you this story that's just absolute gold and you want to share it with the world, and then you go to hit play on the recording and all you hear is, it's going to be really disappointing. And it's going to be really disappointing when you have to call them up and say, oh, hey, you remember that interview I did with you last week? Yeah, we're going to have to do it again. That's not going to be a good experience for them. It's not going to be a good experience for you. So make sure that when you're doing the interview, you have a good space where it's going to be good sound recordings the first time. That way you can sort of breathe deeply and relax while you're actually doing the interview, and everybody can be comfortable. Another important thing to remember is, you know, I mentioned before, asking those open-ended questions. Also, you want to make sure that, you know, it can be really stressful to do an interview, but do your best to make sure that you're not looking overly stressed. Give them eye contact, nod your head. You don't have to nod your head every 3 seconds, but, you know, just make sure, even if you're not necessarily hearing everything that's coming at them because you're so stressed out by the interview, at least fake it, because that'll make them feel more comfortable. You might not have any idea where they're going with an answer, but if you nod your head, it's going to make them feel more comfortable. It's going to be sort of affirming to them that, yes, I am giving my interviewer the answer that they're looking for, and that will give them the confidence to keep talking. And that's probably the most important part, is getting them to keep talking. That's why we ask the open-ended questions. That's why we don't ask, you know, yes, no, like, where did you go to school? Where did you go to school doesn't really lend itself to a story. Now, if you said, tell me your favorite memory from your graduate school, that will be a story. You know, it's open-ended. You always want to make sure that it's open-ended. It's not yes, no, binary questions. There's not one right answer. You want to give them the space to actually, you know, fill in that answer. And then lastly here, I have, don't be afraid to jot down notes. There's going to be a whole lot happening the first couple of times that you do an interview, and you shouldn't be afraid to write down notes. If they say something you weren't expecting and you want to follow up on it, go ahead and write down the notes about it so that you can, you can go back to that and you don't forget. It might feel a little bit distracting to them, but it'll be worth it in the end to have those notes. It'll be a little bit easier to stay grounded with your next question. So once you finish the interview, what do you do next? So I talked earlier, I showed some of these fields. You're going to fill in these fields. As you fill in the fields, you want to make sure that everything that you've got is accurate. So you're going to review how you have the title, what you have as the description. You're going to make sure that you've included all the participants and that you included them the way that they typically would be, like participants-wise. Let's say you're talking to somebody whose name is Robert Smith or Julia Smith. Robert and Julia Smith. An interview with Robert and Julia Smith, but Robert and Julia go by Bob and Julie. You want to make sure if people are going to be looking for it, that you describe it the way that people are going to expect to find it. You're going to want to tag it with keywords, locations, events, those sorts of things. And as we noted, do hashtag AGU100 and a little plug for my program, Path Through Science. If you tag your conversation with hashtag Path Through Science, I'll be reaching out to you to see if we can't do a profile in either my newsletter or somewhere else in the AGU Pathfinder spaces. So yeah, that spot is right here where the star is. So we're going to put in those keywords. Then also you're going to be sharing it. So you want to note, what communities you're going to be sharing it with. As we mentioned, AGU Narratives is the community that is sort of part of this Centennial project. And then also, who can listen to the interview. And there are some different options. Obviously, we want to encourage you to make it open to the public. We're not doing this to hide our science. We're doing it to get these stories out in the open. We're not trying to hide these wonderful stories of science and hide them under a basket. We're trying to put them up so that everybody can see them. So that star right there is where you share with the community. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to Felicita, and she's going to talk about what an outcome could look like after you're done with your interview.
That's right, Nathaniel. The StoryCorps archives actually has hundreds of thousands of stories in it. And during fall meeting, we launched Centennial with the gathering of stories of our scientists using StoryCorps. As you see, we were honored to have the StoryCorps Airstream in the middle of our poster hall. Out of the hundreds of thousands of stories that exist in the StoryCorps archives, only one is chosen for the weekly NPR broadcast. The story of Lori Kogan and her sister Zoe Corville describe the struggles of being a new mom and a field scientist that require being away for months at a time. After this interview, listen to the clip. It'll give you inspiration and motivation that can be found on NPR or through StoryCorps. And in fact, if you look at the AGU Narratives community, the interview can be found there as well. Hey guys, I just think Nathaniel's muted. We're going to go ahead and unmute him.
Oh, thanks, sorry. Yes. All right, so yeah, so what's next for Centennial, AGU Narratives and You? We're about to jump into the Q&A here in just a moment. But before we get into those questions, I want to ask everybody here to either get out a piece of paper or some sort of note-taking device and write down 3 names of people that you think would make for good stories. I'm going to give you a few moments to do that. It's really important to write it down, or at least, document that you're doing it. It's going to make it a lot easier after this interview to go ahead and reach out to them and touch base with them. And that initial contact, can be a little bit tricky. That's one of the reasons why we have the handouts. I would suggest attaching that handout that we have of the AGU Narratives that sort of describes what AGU Narratives is and has some examples of like what the interview process is and sample questions. You know, send that attachment to them and say, hey, I think this is a great idea, and I think that you would make a great interviewee. Let's talk. So, you know, after we're done here and after we finish up with the Q&A, I hope that all of you go out and email those folks there or call them, reach out to them, and get started with your involvement in the Centennial program. Liz, do you have anything else to say before we dive into the Q&A?
Yes, Nathaniel, thank you so much. Through the use of the narratives, you have an opportunity to share stories, your stories, the stories of scientists that have influenced you, or maybe it's even just a person that doesn't have to be a scientist. It's your mom and something that she showed you. But the real unique opportunity is that everyone has entry to get involved and share their story. So we hope that this presentation has helped to have you see yourself in Centennial, and we're readily available to talk with you and help you guide you through your own storytelling process and create your own oral history repository.
All right, great. So we're going to move on to the Q&A now, and just as a reminder, if you do have some questions, go ahead and type them into that question box. But I have a few here already, and I'm going to start off with them. So the first one that I have is, let's see, I'm old school. Do I have to download the app, or can I do interviews outside of my phone? So to answer that, you can record your interviews and then upload them through the StoryCorps desktop browser website that Felissa had shown earlier. So yes, you do not have to record. So the next one, how long should an interview ideally be? So with this one, I think that, you know, it very much depends on the situation. You might have an interview. I did one that I thought was going to be super long, but it wound up just being 10 minutes. It was a very, very dense 10 minutes, but it was only 10 minutes. I did another one where I thought that it was only going to be 10 minutes, and it wound up being 40. So, you know, it's kind of hard to say. A lot of times these happen organically. I would suggest, especially for your early ones, StoryCorps usually advises somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, and I think that that's fair, especially for these, you know, early ones that you'll be doing. All right, next one. After recording an interview, will I have the opportunity to edit before posting? So after recording the interview, StoryCorps within the app itself doesn't really let you cut out pieces of the actual interview, but if you're uploading within the browser, like we mentioned earlier, that is one way that you can do that. You can edit outside of it and then upload your edited recording. I haven't managed to, or I haven't tried to just download the recordings and then upload a new version. I think you probably can do that, but you won't be able to do it within the app itself. You'll have to use the desktop mode. More questions. See, I want to share my own story. Can I still do that without an official interviewer? So the answer is yes, you can. What you can do is set up the questions that you structure your interview in the app. Pick the questions that you think will allow you to prompt you to tell those stories that you're trying to convey, and then just record it just with yourself. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be quite the same as the sort of conversational dialogue that you have if you're doing an interview with another person, but it's perfectly fine to interview just yourself through the app. All right, let's see. Do we have any other questions? Oh, here's a good one. How well should I know the interviewee? Does someone you're less familiar with lend itself to a better back and forth? That's a really excellent question. So it's kind of a conundrum. Obviously, you would think that it would be easier to have a conversation with somebody that you know. But what winds up happening in those situations is sometimes you'll be talking about things that you and the interviewee know so well that you just forget to provide the context. So while it'll be easier to get the person to talk about that story that you really want them to talk about, it can also be a little bit trickier because it's that much more difficult to check yourself from saying things that, without context. You might have in-jokes. You'll be talking about an experiment that you were doing together, and the experiment makes a lot of sense to you and the person you're interviewing, but for the people listening, they're not really sure what you're talking about. So, it's like both sides of the coin. It can be a little bit tricky. Next question that we have, can I share my published interview on social media or LinkedIn? And the answer is yes. Yes, you can. The interviews themselves, because they're in the StoryCorps archive, all have a specific URL. And I think if we go back, I'm going to go back to that slide that had Marcia McNutt. And yeah, here we are. So there should be somewhere in here, I'm not seeing it now, but there is a share feature. You can add it to your favorites, but because this is online on a browser, you can just copy that and just drop it in, and it'll just come to this site with this information. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we're going to wrap it up. So yeah, I just want to, before we wrap up, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I hope that you found this presentation to be useful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at njanik@agu.org or Felicita. Felicita, what's your email?
You can contact me at centennial@agu.org or at fwhite@agu.org.
All right, yeah. So, like we said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You're going to get a recording of this broadcast sent to your inbox within the next day or so. And we'll also have some follow-up emails just to check to see how it went, offer any encouragement if you need it. But like I said, feel free to reach out if you have any trouble at any point or are looking for a little bit of help. Again, thank you everybody for coming, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you everyone as well from the Centennial team, myself and Victoria. Thank you.